Okay. Next up is Paul here, Paul Jost.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me do a quick introduction and we can get going. Are you ready? Yeah.
I think I'm ready.
So,
It depends whether I can share my screen. Yes, I can.
yeah, okay. So Paul Jost is a PhD student still. Yep, over at Bonn University over in Germany. And he's doing he does a lot of tools for systems biology and dealing also with stochastics and also various other numerical algorithms. But he, I think, is going to talk to us a little bit about one of the software they're developing called pyPESTO, correct?
Yes, that is right. Yeah.
All right. Well, without much further ado, here's Paul.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Do you see my screen? Hopefully.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Throughout the talk, I might not see questions, but whenever there are some, just interrupt me. That would be nice. Okay, so yes. Oop, go back. Hi, welcome. Today I'm going to talk about pyPESTO, a modular and scalable tool for parameter estimation. You can think there's a bit like an extension to Wednesday's talk of Joseph Palestine on parameter estimation, but really focused on how can we help you and doing this very easily and very in a manner that allows you to adapt towards the specific problems you are tackling when doing parameter estimation. I'm going to just a quick overview. First, I picked up the model to show you why it's important to do parameter estimation. And funnily enough, this is very similar to Joseph's model. Found that quite interesting. Tell you the general setup parameter estimation, which will be more a slight generalization towards the least squares estimation you saw. And then go through the very integral steps of parameter estimation and how pyPESTO aids you in those steps. Okay, so to start, I also chose a glycolysis model, but a much simplified compared to Joseph's. Mine just contains 3 reactions, an influx of ADP, ADP gets converted to ATP, and ATP just leaves the model of interest. You're now already, after the 3 or 4 days, familiar how to convert this into reactions. We assume mass action kinetics. Obviously, you can also have Michaelis-Menten reactions, depends. And it's quite straightforward, just a synthesis, some kind of conversion of substrate to product, and some degradation. You also probably heard now a lot about what kind of different mathematical descriptions we can do. We can do a stochastic simulation if we look at very small models and kind of small concentrations, the number of molecules. If we want to integrate some kind of spatial model into there, we have some partial differential equations. Or we are going to stay with ordinary differential equations, which is probably most straightforward. And I think you should probably have gotten most familiar with them for the last days. So very easy setup for a non-differential equation, just 2 states. I mentioned 2, 3 parameters for our reactions and 2 initial state parameters. I would deem this a very small model. But this small model can exhibit 3 completely different qualitatively behaviors. One of them is where it got its name from, is the Salkov oscillation, meaning that it enters a stable oscillation process. This honestly looks a bit dampening, but it is it's going to be constantly oscillating. I deemed the other ones by my own names. These are not official names, but we can also have an oscillator, which means we enter a stable, steady state and no oscillation whatsoever. Or we can have the fact that the substrate just explodes and goes until infinity. This in itself might not be surprising, but what struck me when I stumbled over this model is really that we can achieve this with only one parameter that we change. We keep all the other parameters constant. And this really goes to show that it is important to really pinpoint your parameter precisely, get to know what exactly is the parameter. And to do this, you really need some real world data. Yeah, so how do we combine real world data? You already had the amount of setups. I just walk you through this, that we're all on the same page. So we have our ODE model, which is the state vector field and the initial values. And I want to introduce something which we call observables. These observables is basically, given that we have the data, what did we actually measure compared to our model? Because sometimes this is not straightforward. In the easiest case, yes, it is. We just measured the ATP. But staying at ATP, in most cases, we don't measure the ATP of a singular compartment of the cell, but the ATP of the whole cell. So in this case, ATP would be, the observable would be more like the sum over all the different compartments of ATP. There might also be just some relative data. So we have A times the ATP plus some kind of offset. We deem this just Y and say it's some kind of function depending on the state of our model with some parameters, possible scaling parameters. This is very similar to in hegemony to having an assignment rule, for example, saying you can define this actually with an assignment rule in hegemony. So this is what we theoretically measure. The actual measurements, and now here comes basically where we can introduce statistics. We assume to be some kind of error model. It's what we should have measured plus an error or times an error. And it's completely up to you what you want to assume as a noise model. A very obvious choice or very regular use choice is the additive normal noise. If you choose additive normal noise, then we can now create something which is called a likelihood. And the likelihood function describes basically, given a set of parameter theta, what is the probability? It's not exactly the probability, but you can view it as that, to have created the data set that we have. And so the higher it is, the more likely it is that the parameter produces the data. And you can see here, you have your residuals, the Y, the measurement minus the observable, divided by the scaling factor and then squared. So it's basically like a least squared error, but it's how would you call it? A weighted least squared error. And it's kind of intuitive that we want to maximize this because that would give us the parameter that is most likely to produce the data that we have. That's not, it's a bit different to the posterior, which would be the parameter that is most likely given the data, but we'll get to that when we come to uncertainty. Okay, so this is our likelihood function. We want to maximize this. So we now get into parameter estimation. What are the steps? I think there's always a never-ending story because you really are you're never finished with it. You can always do something else. We already have our model, we have our experimental data, and we have some kind of objective function, which might be our likelihood. From here on, we need to do the parameter optimization. We've already heard about something like differential evolution optimization, global swarm-based optimization, gradient optimization. So you have a lot of different optimizers that perform differently depending on the state or on your particular model. And you need to choose between them because you don't know beforehand which one is the better one. And even within the optimization, you have a lot of options like the swarm-based size, the amount of starts if you do a gradient local-based optimization. If you do gradient free. So a lot of things to choose there. If you run the optimization, it gives you a parameter fit. The parameter now needs to be evaluated. This is, as you can see by the amount of errors that go out of it, the most crucial point of every kind of calibration. How well did we calibrate? Which we call the goodness of fit. And this is also where it breaks down, and most of the times you have to go back. But you need some kind of indication where to go back. So it might be that you just choose the wrong optimizer. So you want to change your optimizer, in which case you just go back to run it all again, which sometimes takes about a week. I'll be honest, it's also already long. It might be that you have the right optimizer, but Joseph also already talked about bounds of your parameters that you allow. And it might be that your bounds are just too narrow or too wide. So you want to change basically the formulation of your objective function, or you want to change some things in your parameter estimation. And if this also breaks down and you still can't explain the data, then it might be that you really just chose the wrong model. Then you need to go back to literature research, find a new model, perhaps do some model selection on some other possibilities, and start all over again. So you're already here running into an eternal loop. But let's say you find at least somewhere where your model fits. Then you want to know, how sure am I about my parameter? Is my true parameter in some kind of region of what I found? Can I assume this? And there is this propagate towards prediction. If you are, for example, looking for a drug target, you really don't want, you want to have a small margin of error in your prediction of your model dynamics. And so we come to uncertainty quantification and how is your identifiability of your parameters. If this goes wrong, it usually ends up with you have to measure a few more things. Either you have to get new data, the same experiment, you have to measure some different things, some different observables, you have to perturb your system in a different manner, having a different condition, and you're back to square one and start all over again. But even, and that's the thing, even if you end up with all this, everything is fine. You can say you have a calibrated model, but that doesn't mean that's the only calibrated model that explains your data. So you might as well just stack on top of the whole parameter estimation and model selection, which becomes increasingly more expensive, to be fair. And it's basically doing all those steps for different kinds of models. And then obviously you need a criterion. How do I decide which model I should select among my candidate models? Okay, so I'll now walk you through all those steps and show you how pyPESTO can help you in doing this, hopefully a bit easier, a bit more flexible. Okay. So the first thing is, to be fair, not pyPESTO, but PETA, which is, how do we describe a parameter estimation problem? We already saw that parameter estimation problems include a lot of things, like your model, like your data, like the observation model and your error models. And you want to define this in a reproducible manner to be able to share this, to switch perhaps the platform for your parameter estimation, and to perhaps make easy changes to your model without having to change too many things. And this is where PTAB comes into play. This is a standardized format to describe parameter estimation problems. How does it look like? Well, if we think about a common setup where we want to have parameter estimation, we have our generic model, a biological system, which will have an SBML format. So this is just PTAB uses an SBML model. We already said we have observations, observables, and with some noise accommodating those observables. So these will be packed in an observable table. And then the data, we look at it twofold. Basically, we're saying each data set is a collection of different experiments. And experience here means really that we change some things where we have control over. We might knock out a certain reaction, we might knock out a certain gene. We start in a steady state by letting it accommodate the cells for quite a long time. And for each of those measurements, each of those conditions, we have measurements. So 2 other tables. And of course, the parameter estimation problem wouldn't be a parameter estimation problem without specifying what are the parameters we want to optimize. So another table. And by having those 4 tables in one SBML model, having them separately, we now can add very easily new data. We can add new observables, new conditions, and can really share this across platforms, making it much easier to switch if we have to, because some optimizers we want to change or we need to do some uncertainty quantification. Okay. Let's start with pyPESTO. If you have from a PTAB file, it makes our life much easier. I want to mention that we don't necessarily need this, because you could write your own objective function, but don't do it unless it's very specific that you have to do it, because it's really a lot of work, and meaning that it's slightly error prone. And in most cases, you want some ways to make this easier for you. If you use beta, then what you have to do is, in the model, is usually you need some kind of simulator. And there are different simulators supported in pyPESTO. One of them you already got familiar with throughout the last days, which is Roadrunner. There's ArmyCheap as well. You can use Julia or JAX for some automatic gradients to get them much cheaper. Each of those simulators has its upsides and its downsides. It depends on what kind of estimation you want to do, what kind of model you have. But if you choose one of them, then loading the parameter estimation problem into pyPESTO is just 3 lines of code. You say, I want to use my p-top problem. I import it. Basically, this is telling Python, yes, create a p-top, create a problem, a parameter estimation problem out of this, and you create it. Now you're good to go. You basically loaded your objective function. You can feed it a parameter, evaluate it. You can change your bounds. You can change parameters you want to estimate. Everything you can imagine for parameter estimation. Okay, so if we have this, we obviously now want to choose our optimizer. As I already said, there's a multitude of optimizers for a specific reason, because no single optimizer is best for all problems. Highly model specific, and you in general don't know it beforehand. That means you need to test it out. And testing it out means that you really have to switch between all these optimizers, which require different input, give you different output, making comparison kind of hard. And this is really where pyPESTO shines, because you can just easily switch between them, evaluate which one you like more, and use them further on. We have a variety of optimizers. We have the differential evolution optimizers, any kind of cycle optimizers. We have the swarm-based optimizer from PySwarms, or something like gradient-based optimizer from Feed. How does this look? Again, it's just 3 lines of code. It looks like more. I just put them into 2 lines to make it fit the screen. You just define, I want to use my SciPy optimizer, because the SciPy optimizers have a lot of methods within, like optimizers within this optimizer class. You choose your method, some scale, some meta parameters. You can also track the history, meaning that it tracks all the evaluations of your objective function, which allows you to see how effective am I with my optimizer? How fast is it converging? How well is it converging? What might be reasons that it's not converging? Everything like this. And then minimizing this is just calling the minimize function with your problem, your optimizer, and your experiment. Obviously, there are a lot of more options you can choose, but you're good to go with this. And here, for example, I have compare 2 optimizers, which is the VDES optimizer and this LFPGS from SciPy. And it shows you the optimizer steps it has taken and the objective function. And as you can see, for example, here, this simple history tracking allows you to check, okay, VDES obviously takes a lot less steps. So it's much more efficient in the amount of steps it needs, but it does not find the very best optimum. This is found by the LBFGS, but the LBFGS takes a lot more evaluation. And now this is basically becoming a ping pong between how much resources do I have and how accurate do I need to be. I think this is always in parameter estimation, in model simulation, and model selection. In all of those computational methods, it's how much money do we have? Comes down to a bit. So this is, but it allows you to make this decision in a more informed manner. Okay, after we have optimized, as I said already, this is the key point where we need to decide where we go back to. And how do we do this? Obviously, through visualization. The first one is quite easy, straightforward comparison of simulation and data. Then we have something which is called a waterfall plot to estimate do we perhaps need to change the optimizer, or what do we need to change in the optimizer? Then you can have some visualizations to check whether you want to change your parameter estimation problem. And all of this is done and hopefully always just one line to really ease you into this. For example, here you can see in a model fit on the right side, the straight lines are the actual simulation and the dotted lines are the data. You can see we fit those two values well, while this one looks really, we're not so sure whether we like this or we don't like it. It's also not quite clear whether those points might just be a bit outliers. We're not there yet, but it gives you a hint already. Then we can see here, this is a waterfall plot, which is most often used for local start, multi-start local optimization. And it sorts you all your optimization runs by goodness of value, by your objective function value, and clusters them together. So you can easily see that out of our 25 starts, around half of them end up in the same optimum. This is a good thing because it hints towards a very large basin of projection, and it might give you an incline that this might be your global optimum. And those here might be some local optima you ran into. But this is only the objective function value, and now you want to hope that this is actually exactly the same point, which is why you look at the parameter distribution. I have to say this here is a different color. We realized only later that this is not the same. And you can see we do find the same point. This is very refreshing because it's not always the case. Let me tell you this. This is already a good sign of parameter identifiability. So it shows that we have a clear optimum. But you also see a problem here because you're hitting the bounds very consistently. And so that could tell you that perhaps you need to change the bounds and you don't need to necessarily change the optimizer. It's always about the back and forth and how do we want to do this. And that's why it's important to have really easy visualization methods. Okay. So if we have a good model fit, let's say we proceed with the model fit we have, then it comes to determining our parameter uncertainty. Parameter uncertainty means we need some kind of confidence interval on our parameter. There's a different amount of methods for this, varying in complexity and what they actually give you. Just quickly over them, the Fisher information matrix approximation is that you assume that around your optimum, your objective function landscape is convex, and that you can estimate this with some kind of Taylor approximation. And so you approximate the Hessian of your objective function through the Fisher information matrix. And through this, get very cheaply a kind of estimate on your parameters, which are then assumed to be basically normally distributed. It's cheap, but as you've already seen last week, on Wednesday, when you saw some kind of the objective function landscapes, in most cases, you really are not convex around your local optimum. And this is not always so nice. You can also do Bayesian sampling, which is some kind of Markov chain Monte Carlo sampling, where you find directly the posterior distribution. This has the very nice upside that it gives you a holistic view on your whole parameter estimation problem, gives you not just the marginal distribution, but the combined distribution. pyPESTO supports the various samplers for this. It has the downside of being comparatively more expensive because you need to do a lot of simulations. And if your model is not identifiable, your Markov chain might not converge, leading you to sampling without any. And there's profile likelihoods, which is very kind to optimization again, where you fix only one parameter at a specific value and then see what is the best value I can find given that the parameter, what is the best objective function value I can find given that I fixed this one parameter. By having this, you can compare this with the overall best, and you can make, there are some proofs on the distribution of the difference of this, and through this can compute your confidence interval again. I chose the example of sampling in our case, to tell you how pyPESTO does this, but tissue information matrix and profile likelihoods are not any more complex, at least from lines of code than this. It's again, no, it's 4 lines of code this time. We choose a sampler from the samplers that we support. We also interface very famous samplers like the PIMC4 sampling. And then we just say, okay, sample this and that amount of time. And then again, you have some kind of visualization methods to see how easily a certain. For example, here we can see when this is the sampling trace, measuring all the objective function, or in this case, the log posterior function of our model, and whether our chain converged. You can see at some point it did switch, and then it stayed basically in a very general case in the same distribution. We would assume that this chain converged. And what are the marginal distribution from this? We can see here that most of them look very well. But this here spans 2 orders of magnitude, this parameter, which is really not a good thing, because you don't want to spend multiple orders of magnitude on a parameter. As I showed you in the very beginning, multiple orders of magnitude can really exhibit completely different behavior. So this would be something you would want to work on. And it gives you an amount of uncertainty. But this is only uncertainty in the parameters. So how do we propagate this towards our model prediction? Because model prediction is in the end what we want to use.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Paul, back on the 11. You know, when you're doing your sampling, is that the sampling again of the parameter space that you're, optimizing against?
Oh, yes.
And
you
also
still have the bounds.
And does it have a default sampling algorithm? Is it just this one, or do you have to pick, or how do you find out which one's best to use?
I do realize, to answer the question, yes, we have a default, because I didn't define the sampler in here. It's on me. So I'm actually defining a sampler without using it. Just realized that now. But it depends a bit. Like it's just like optimization. Also for sampling, there are various routines. Because for example, this adaptive parallel tempering means that we have different chains that run in parallel, sampling and exchanging information between each other. Another option is that you change the temperature, meaning the acceptance of the next sample throughout the whole run, having it in the beginning very high and always accepting the next proposed sample, but in the end growing more selective basically on what you want to choose. There's no real, again, I wouldn't say there's a fits best for all of them. And in sampling, most of the cases, like in my experience, the problem is really that most models are not really well identifiable without a lot of work. And before you do this, sampling mostly runs for a very long time. That is also.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, but you're right. We do have a default, which we're using here. Okay. So how do we forward this uncertainty in our parameters towards our prediction? We do this by generating ensembles, so-called ensembles. Ensembles here really means a collection of parameter sets. That means, for example, if we take our sampling, we take every 4th sample that we have in our trace, pick that, and collect them all together in one big bag of parameters, I'd say, which we call ensemble. And then to forward this into model prediction, you simulate each of those parameters, and then you can have confidence intervals on your output. We support different generations of ensembles, from sampling, from optimization, or from the history even. And the code here is only partial because it shows you how to create the ensemble. Because how to create the prediction is a bit more intricate, and also highly depends on what kind of simulator you want to use. So this is a bit more code. I omitted this. But when you do this, you can forward this, as I said, and get confidence interval on your output. And then here, for example, can compare, is your uncertainty more rooted by the different conditions you have? So is there perhaps one condition you really can't fit quite well? Or is there an observable you can't fit quite well? And what are possible things that you want to select more on, or do a different set of experiments on a certain condition or on a certain observable, and zoom in more. Okay, so we went through this. Now we have our calibrated model. But are we sure about our model? For this, we want to talk about model selection. So as I said, sometimes the model structure might not be known, or even if you know it, you only partially know it. And so what you do is you select a number of model candidates. Usually this is done by saying, okay, a reaction might exist or might not exist. That is the easiest way to do this, and both are one candidate. The problem here that you have is that if you have 10 reactions that might or might not exist, you have 2 to the power of 10 models that might be the model that explains the data. So that gives you 2 things. First, we need to find the best one, and we need a very good algorithm to walk us through all those possible models. Let's first talk a bit about the possible models. In our case, this here is an example. We just have 3 reactions. Each of them might or might not exist, giving us 8 different candidate models. And if we fit them, here's a problem. Let's say we look at this third parameter. Comparing if it exists or doesn't exist means that if we calibrate this, the one where it exists can just scale down the parameter to basically 0 and being equivalent to the parameter not existing and the reaction not existing. That means that the more complex model will always be at least as good as the less. And that's why you need to strike a balance between complexity and goodness of fit. And this is also something that people really have to take care of in large language models, because you have 1 million or 1 billion parameters. It's always a question, when are we overfitting this? On when are we really looking at the dynamics? And in model selection, one way to do this is usually through some kind of value like AIC or BIC. Both of them combine the likelihood and the goodness of fit, basically, with the penalty on the number of parameters that you're using. Because you really don't want to use 2,000 parameters for, I don't know, 20 data points, because you'll probably overfit. pyPESTO supports model selection through ptype-select, which is an extension of ptype, which has here just one more table, which describes the number of possible models. And then the code is, again, a 3-liner. I'm going always with 3 lines. You load your selection problem, the ptype selection problem, you create a parameter estimation selection problem, and then you do the selection. How do we do the selection? So the important part I already mentioned is we have a lot of possible models. And in each model, we need to do parameter estimation. And so it becomes even more important to be highly efficient in doing this. And so the easiest case scenario would be brute forcing all of them. Don't want to do this. Another case would be if you are fine with not doing an exhaustive search, you can do forward or backward algorithms. Forward meaning you start basically with no parameters and successively add another parameter and say which one is the best to add until you don't want to add anymore. Or backwards, just the opposite. You start with all the parameters, you take some out. pyPESTO also has actually an algorithm that does an exhaustive search combining forward and backward and combining information about AIC, BIC being exhaustive without having to evaluate all the possible models, by knowing that what I said before, that a more complex model will never be have a worse fit than the less complex model. So by fitting a less complex model, we already get some information about the more complex. Okay.
I have a couple questions again.
Yes.
So you have these possible models. Does the user have to make these, or does the tool in pyPESTO that generates what it thinks could be possible models?
So yes, you have to think about which models you want to take in, but the p-type select allows you to basically just say the reactions that you want to include, like that are your possible models, or possible on-off reactions, and then it creates basically a mesh grid out of all those possibilities. So you don't have to define all the 8 models. You can also say, I have theta 1, theta 2, theta 3, which I might estimate or might not have.
Okay.
And then it creates you this automatically. And when loading this into pyPESTO, this is done automatically. But sometimes you want to be very specific on your, like you don't want to have the whole space, but only like, yeah, it might be theta 1 and theta 2, or it might only be theta 3. So you can also be very selective on the models you want to choose.
Okay. And I have one more question. You know, it has the .yaml file. Do you have a brief, or is that like what's in the YAML file?
Oh,
You have
yeah.
an example?
Oh, true. Yeah, I didn't mention this. Yeah, the YAML file consists of 5 lines, which is the SBML model. So it says SBML model,
Okay.
.. name of the SBML file, where your SBML file is. Then for each of those tables, where is the table?
Okay.
Basically, it's a collector of all the different tables and the model. Yeah, I didn't mention this. Thank you for pointing that out.
Okay.
This is the collector. You could do it also not from YAML, by just defining the problem from directly the SBML model and the 4 different tables. But it's usually easier if you just have a collector.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. Okay. So I think I'm going to finish in time. We talked about all those different steps. We talked about how pyPESTO can aid you in all those different steps. And obviously, that doesn't mean that it's going to be very easy and fast. No, it's not. But it's really about being flexible, because we encountered in sampling, we encountered in optimization, in prediction uncertainty, in the simulating you want to choose, in your model selection. There's a lot of variety that you have to choose from, and you preemptively don't know which one to take, or which route to take. And so you really want to be flexible in what you choose. And it really, for this, you need one consistent type of input-output. And this pyPESTO allows you to just do this and change those options by just changing one line of code, making it much more flexible, making it easier to write it, and making it less lines of code, because you also don't want to write your own simulator or your own estimator. So yes, pyPESTO allows you to do this for a wide variety of models. If you use multi-start local optimization, is also computationally efficient, because we distribute this over cores, so you can use it on clusters. Roadrunner is very efficient already. Armage is also very efficient, being distributed also and being able to be used on a cluster. So this is also quite nice, and because we interface them, you can use them on a cluster, because it's really expensive. You don't want to have run your computer for a whole week. I did this in the beginning, and no, computer just kind of hard. And I have, just as a collection, if you didn't believe me that this is quite small lines of code, leaving out some of the options, I can fit this on one page. I left out the parameter, the propagation of the ensembles, but everything else is in there. And you just need to insert some kind of options. So what this means is, if we have this code snippet, for example, we just need to exchange our model if we want to run a different model. So you don't have to do it again from scratch. If we want a different optimizer, we just plug in here a different optimizer. And so this is really the core concept of the whole parameter estimation pipeline, and you can just adapt it as you like on the fly. Obviously, there are a lot of options I didn't talk about later on. But with this, I want to thank you for your attention. Here's a functional overview again. We talked about the definition of the problem, the optimization, local, global, gradient-free, gradient-based, and certainly quantification, visualizations, and then storage parallelization. All this. Yes. And with this, thank you for your attention. And I'm happy to receive that.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. Does anyone have some questions or comments? Do you have, Paul, a simple example of a simple model, an actual model, and maybe like look at, we have a few minutes here. Do you have something like that available to briefly go through, or?
I can do that probably. Let me just
Because there's
quickly stop my.
little bit of it abstracted, so it'd be nice to
Yes, I do get that
example.
Let me just pull one up. Perhaps I can also directly go to the read the docs of pyPESTO, because that is the docs. Can pull that up. Will be just one example in the documentation. Examples. Let me share my screen again. In the meantime, there's a question which I might read in a second. We can go there. Okay. I know this will be hard to define depending on how complex model is, but given you said possibilities grow factorial with the number of reactions, how about how many reactions would be explored for all combinations? I guess this you're asking whether there is like a maximum of reactions you can be not so sure about. I would say that highly depends, because if say all the reactions you think about are the ones that are in your model, so you're unsure about any of those reactions, that means that while it might be 20 or 30, the model itself is very small and very fast to simulate. And so with efficient algorithms, you can get through this in like a week, perhaps even 2 weeks. And so you can have something like 20 or 30 not so sure parameters. And so a parameter space of 2 to the power of 13. But if you have already 1,000 different reactions and you want to add 2 or more, then it gets much more expensive, because each simulation and each optimization may take a week in itself, like the optimization, not the simulation. And it grows exponentially more difficult if you look at multiscale models, which are much more expensive to compute. And then estimation is already a problem, and model selection becomes even more. Hope that helped. Do you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I hope there is a problem in there. Oh, yes. I'm not sure whether this is specified directly. Yes. This is a model taken from, it's actually the Böhm model, which is taken from literature. And as you can see here, with the observables, to have a more complex idea of observables, are really some very complicated formulas, picking together different variables, different states. And while we have a lot of states, we don't have a lot of observables, and we mostly deal with relative data. This is also something one has to note. In the least cases, you actually directly measure what you have in the model. It's mostly relative. Sometimes it's even qualitative and or semi-quantitative. In which case, pyPESTO also has ways to deal with it, but it gets a bit harder to do this. Okay, so we define our standard deviations for each observer. We've defined a standard deviation. The important part here is why do we want to have different standard deviations for different observers? And it comes a bit down to, if we think about least squares estimation, if you have measurements on different scales of dimensions, then a general least squares optimization will favor a lot the optimization of your highest values. So if one of your values is in the range of 1,000, or the other side to the 10 to the power of minus 3 or something, it won't care so much about fitting the 10 to the power of minus 3 and care much more about the. And so by making the standard deviations a bit dependent on your scale of your output, you allow the model to really fit everything in a more clear way and a more unbiased approach, I'd say, not just based on the amount of measurements you have.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess we're running out of time, so this is you have this
one more question in the chat if you want. Just what are the different options for the optimality criterion?
Yeah. So usually you use a multitude of them. So the first one is number of function evaluations. This is the most straightforward because at some point you don't want to continue, because in a lot of cases, because we're dealing with very high dimensional spaces, your objective function landscape is quite non-steep, let's say. So there's not a lot of changes. And so you run into a lot of evaluations without changing too much. This brings me directly to the second argument, which is change in parameter value, change in best parameter value. So that means if for a consecutive number of times, you don't change by a lot, this is the tolerance levels, then you will finish, you'll stop. And the last one is if you use gradients, is the gradient value. If the gradient value is 0, you are sure to be in a local minimum, so you can stop. In general, you use all three of them combined. And this is one of the hyperparameters you tune your model with. Usually all of them have very sensible defaults and you're kind of fine with them. But if you know, for example, that you only have very, very small values, then you need to, of your objective function, then you need to decrease your tolerances as well. But most of the time, the tolerances are a mixture of absolute tolerance and relative tolerance, which again is, as it states, absolute tolerance, the actual difference between two function evaluations, relative tolerance meaning how much percent did I get better. So it even, like from my experience, the sensible defaults are very good. And the problem is that if you decrease them by 1 order of magnitude, sometimes you get slightly better results, but you're running for 200% more time. Oh yeah, this is perhaps how I decide on those. There's another question. Is there a reason why one would use different standard deviations rather than try to rescale the model parameters to be on the same orders? Oh, interesting question. The standard deviations are not the standard deviations of the parameters, but the standard deviations of your output. And there are ways to, if you scale your output, you're basically also giving it a different standard deviation, so to say. Because if you recall the objective function where we divided basically our residual through the standard deviation, this is kind of a scaling method of scaling it to all the same scale. So you could actually even view it as the same as rescaling this. But it gives the optimizer also the option of changing that on the fly on how sure it can fit the data. Because if you optimize the standard deviation as well, the optimizer will automatically, if it's very sure about a certain output that it can fit this, it will decrease the standard deviation, giving you more of a uncertainty in your fit of that singular observable, if that answers the question a bit. But it's not standard deviations of the parameters.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much, Paul.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. All right.